Here is my final top 25 out of the whole 2023-2024 season. And yes, I only have 1 through 11 on here because there is a lot to talk about. If you want to see the full top 25, that will be the next video. So before I talk about my rankings, let's put some groundwork down first. So there have been some nasty conversations going on this year. And people are trusting the eye test way too much. I would say right now it's about 50% resume and 50% eye test. If that was the case, why didn't we just crown Georgia national champions at the beginning of the year? Oh wait, because it doesn't work like that? There's human error and bias in every person if you like it or not. Therefore, the eye test should be just a little part of it, and resume should be really high. So I think this is about perfect. 95% resume and 5% context. And I'm using context as understand why that game was played and what it meant for both teams. As we see, bowl games don't mean much for some teams. Where they would have beat them in the regular season, they got potentially blown out in the bowl game. So if we are going off a 95% resume, we have to break down what does resume mean. So here I ranked what order you should do your resume in, as in which one's more important. Firstly, record. Winning is better than losing. It doesn't mean everything, but it's true. Then head-to-head, which is super important because why else would we play games in? Strength of schedule or strength of record, common opponents, and then anything else. So let's go back to this head-to-head for 1 second. Right here, I'm showing a chain of teams that played each other. Michigan beat Washington, Washington beat Texas, Texas beat Alabama, and Alabama beat Georgia. Could Georgia potentially beat Washington? Well, maybe, but they had their chance to go to the playoffs and prove that, and they choked it away. All these teams have similar records, so I'm respecting the head-to-head. So then we throw in the two other teams here. Michigan has a win over Ohio State, and Washington has a win over Oregon. And that is where this can get dicey because you could potentially move them in any way you want to. But here we go back to my top 11. I will explain every single spot. Michigan, Washington, 1-2, best teams, period. Actually, I do have Florida State 3. They didn't get beat all year long. They scheduled a preseason top 5 team in LSU, beat a top 20 team in Clemson, and beat about a top 15 in Louisville without their starting quarterback. And people who say, well, it's a different team without Jordan Travis, you aren't wrong, but football doesn't start in November. It starts all the way back in August. Since no one proved that they could beat Florida State with all their players not opting out, they get the third spot. And just a reminder, I am not submitting a college football playoff ballot. I am just ranking my 1 through 11 here. If you think there isn't a difference, you're a casual. Nextly, I slotted in Ohio State next. I think they played Michigan the hardest out of any team this year. McCord threw that pick on the 20. They were literally 20 yards from potentially being the national champions this year. I know Bama went into overtime with Michigan, but Michigan mostly controlled that whole game and gave them easy touchdowns. With that muff punt that gave them like a 10-yard field to score. Then nextly, I slotted in Oregon. I know they lost to Washington twice, but if any of these teams played Washington twice, they probably would also have 2 losses. Again, remember these head-to-head, and Oregon played a way better game, both games, than Texas did against Washington. So that's why I slot Oregon in at the 5. 6, 7, 8 is pretty standard. Respecting the head-to-head. If you want to complain, well, then that team should have just beat the other team. Finally, down through 9 through 11, only for sure that needs to happen in here is that Ole Miss has to be over Missouri. I gave Ole Miss the nod over Penn State because of the bowl game. I know, yes, Penn State did have key defensive players sit out. I know a lot of people are going to be upset with the Missouri behind Ole Miss. If you look at their record, they're the same. They don't play each other, so there's no head-to-head. Ole Miss technically has the better strength of schedule and strength of record. Then also think about this. If the SEC had no divisions, Ole Miss would have been 3rd in the conference and Missouri would have been 5th. And if you're wondering how that worked, Bama 1, Georgia 2, and then Ole Miss, LSU, and Missouri all had 2 losses. So how would have they decided it? There are head-to-head matchups that would decide it. Ole Miss beat LSU, and LSU beat Missouri. Therefore, Ole Miss would have been 3rd, and Missouri would have been 5th. That's why Ole Miss has to be over Missouri. So the highest Missouri could be is 10. Now, quickly, I want to say the couple things that you could change and I would not be upset with. If you want to slide Ohio State and Oregon down a couple spots, be my guest, because you are splitting hairs in all these teams, but I stand on where I put them. And then also the big mover, Penn State. If they want to be as low as 11 or as high as 9, I am okay with that. And then I can get why people want to move Florida State down, but you are going down a dark rabbit hole if you do that. Let me give you a quick example. You're saying going 13-0 just doesn't matter anymore, and you could open up the idea of Penn State being in the college football playoffs. They have 2 really good quality losses in both one-score games. Therefore, why shouldn't they be in? You are opening up conversations like that. We see this year where we were talking about the best 4 teams in the playoffs, where last year we were talking about the 4 most deserving teams in the playoffs. And if you think that's wrong, then why didn't Alabama get in over TCU? But anyways, here is my top 11. I'll be releasing my top 25 in a couple hours.